away from my engine, boy." The words cut through Hangar 7 like a blade. Colonel Victoria Hayes stood there, her polished boots gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her voice thundering with authority that came from 15 years of clawing her way to the top. She was staring down Marcus Webb, a 22-year-old recruit whose hands were still holding tools he had no business touching. At least, that's what she thought. This wasn't just any hangar. Fort Mitchell, tucked away in the mountains of Colorado, housed the most advanced fighter jet program in the world. The F-35 Lightning II facility. Billions of dollars in technology. Decades of engineering genius. And right now, one of those $30 million machines sat silent and broken, and Colonel Hayes was running out of time. "What makes you think?" she continued, stepping closer until her boots were inches from his worn ones. "You can touch a $30 million jet? This isn't your neighborhood garage, recruit." Marcus didn't back down. 40 personnel were watching. Every eye in that hangar was on him, but he held his ground. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I heard something unusual in the engine before it failed." "You heard something?" Hayes laughed. It was the kind of laugh that could strip paint off walls, sharp, cutting, designed to humiliate. "Listen carefully, recruit. Fix this engine and I'll marry you myself. But since that's impossible," she paused, letting the crowd's nervous laughter build. "Grab that rag and clean my boots instead." The hangar fell silent, except for the ticking of cooling metal. NATO officials would arrive in 18 hours. Defense contracts worth billions hung in the balance. Hayes's promotion to general depended on flawless execution. She had no idea she'd just made a promise that would destroy everything she'd built. "Let me take you back 6 hours earlier, before this confrontation, before everything changed. Fort Mitchell wasn't just a military base. It was a symbol, the pinnacle of American military aviation. And on this particular morning, that symbol was about to crack." Captain Sarah Martinez had been conducting routine training maneuvers when the unthinkable happened. At 15,000 feet, the F-35's engine suddenly lost power. She'd managed an emergency landing, her hands steady despite the terror, but the jet that rolled into the hangar was essentially a very expensive paperweight. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's head mechanic with 20 years of experience, had run every diagnostic known to man. Computer screens filled with error codes that pointed nowhere. The engine showed no visible damage, no leaks, no burned components. It simply refused to start. "This doesn't make sense," Rodriguez muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the hangar's air conditioning. "All systems check out, but she won't even turn over." Behind him, Colonel Hayes paced like a caged animal. Every step was measured, controlled, but you could feel the panic radiating off her. Her perfectly pressed uniform, the eagles gleaming on her shoulders, they represented everything she'd sacrificed to get here. She was the first woman to lead Fort Mitchell's elite training program. She'd fought for this position against men who didn't think she belonged. And tomorrow's NATO demonstration was supposed to be her crowning achievement. Representatives from 12 allied nations flying in to witness the F-35's capabilities. Senator Williams from the Armed Services Committee would be watching. This was her moment to prove she belonged at the top. "How long for a replacement engine?" she demanded. Rodriguez didn't look up. 72 hours minimum. The demonstration is in 18. Failure wasn't an option. Not when her male colleagues were waiting for her to stumble. Not when everything she'd worked for hung in the balance. That's when she noticed him. Marcus Webb, standing at the edge of the maintenance bay, watching with eyes that saw too much. For 3 months, this young recruit had been, in her mind, a problem. Not because he caused trouble, but because he didn't fit. His Tennessee accent, his state school degree, his habit of actually touching equipment instead of relying on computers and protocols. Everything about him screamed, "Doesn't belong here." Hayes had made sure he knew his place. While other recruits with lesser test scores received advanced training, she'd relegated Marcus to cleaning duties, inventory management, grunt work. She'd convinced herself it was about maintaining standards. Deep down, she knew the truth was uglier. "Thompson," she barked, "what are you doing here?" Marcus straightened. "Reporting for evening maintenance duty, ma'am." "The adults are working. Find somewhere else to be." "Ma'am," he hesitated. I couldn't help but notice the engine failure pattern. The hangar's atmosphere shifted. Conversations died. Even the constant hum of the ventilation system seemed to quiet. "You couldn't help but notice." Hayes's voice rose. "Since when do janitors analyze fighter jet engines?" Several mechanics turned to watch. This was getting interesting. Marcus had learned to navigate these moments carefully. 3 months of systematic humiliation had taught him when to speak and when to stay silent. But something about this situation felt different. This wasn't just about Hayes's career or the NATO demonstration. Dozens of pilots would eventually fly these jets into combat zones. Lives depended on understanding what went wrong. "I've been studying the maintenance manuals during my off hours," he said quietly. "The acoustic signature before engine failure suggests acoustic signature." Hayes stepped closer, her voice dripping with disdain. "Did you learn that at your state school auto shop?" Several mechanics chuckled nervously. They'd witnessed Hayes's treatment of Marcus before, but never this publicly, never this viciously. Marcus's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched slightly at his sides. "Actually, ma'am, I earned my mechanical engineering degree from Tennessee Tech while working 2 jobs to support my family." The admission hung in the air like a challenge. Hayes felt her authority being questioned in front of her subordinates. That couldn't stand. Mechanical engineering from a school I've never heard of? How impressive. Her laugh was harsh. "Here's what's going to happen, Webb. You're going to grab a mop and clean the restrooms. Leave the impossible problems to people with real qualifications." "Ma'am, with all due respect..." "Respect?" The word echoed through the hangar. "You want to talk about respect while a billion-dollar demonstration hangs in the balance?" She gestured toward the silent F-35. 20 of the military's finest engineers are stumped by this problem, but somehow you think your state school education makes you qualified to solve it." The crowd around them had grown. Word was spreading through the base that something was happening in Hangar 7. Off-duty personnel were finding excuses to walk by. The confrontation was becoming entertainment. Hayes sensed the audience and played to it. "Tell you what, Webb, I'll make you a deal in front of all these witnesses." She raised her voice so everyone could hear. "If you can fix this engine, if you can solve what our best people can't, I'll personally recommend you for officer training. Hell, I'll write you a letter of recommendation to MIT myself." The mechanics exchanged glances. This was escalating beyond normal workplace tension. But Hayes wasn't finished. The humiliation had to be complete, public, memorable. "In fact, fix this engine by dawn and I'll marry you myself. I'll even wear my dress blues for the ceremony." The hangar erupted in nervous laughter. Several people pulled out phones to record what they assumed would be the recruit's inevitable backing down. Hayes smiled triumphantly. She'd created a no-win situation. Marcus would either refuse, and confirm his place in the hierarchy, or accept and fail spectacularly in front of everyone. What she didn't expect was the quiet confidence that crossed his face. Marcus looked past Hayes to the silent F-35. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, words spoken in a barn workshop years ago. "Every engine has its own voice, son. You just have to be quiet enough to hear what it's trying to tell you." He'd been listening to that engine all day, even from across the hangar, and what he'd heard didn't match what the computers were reporting. "I accept your challenge, ma'am." The laughter died instantly. Hayes's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed viciousness. "Excellent. You have until dawn. That gives you about 12 hours to accomplish what's impossible." She turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, place your bets. Will our janitor solve the mystery of the F-35? But to understand how Marcus Webb became the man who could hear what others couldn't, you need to know his story. It begins in a place where broken engines were just another part of life, and fixing the impossible was a family tradition. The story of Marcus Webb began 40 miles outside Nashville, Tennessee, in a place where broken things weren't thrown away. They were brought back to life. His grandfather, Samuel Big Sam Webb, had spent World War II as a mechanic with the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. While those brave pilots earned fame for their combat heroics, Big Sam worked in the shadows, keeping P-51 Mustangs flying when spare parts were scarce, and prejudice ran deep. After the war, Sam returned to Tennessee with calloused hands and a head full of knowledge that no college could teach. He built a small garage behind his farmhouse where neighbors brought their dying tractors, sputtering pickup trucks, and broken dreams wrapped in rust and oil. Marcus spent his childhood in that garage, watching his grandfather perform miracles with little more than intuition and determination. "Come here, boy," Big Sam would say, his weathered hands guiding small fingers to an engine block. "Close your eyes and tell me what you feel." At first, Marcus felt nothing but vibration and heat, but gradually, under his grandfather's patient teaching, he began to sense the subtle rhythms that revealed an engine's secrets. A slight irregularity in idle speed that predicted carburetor failure. A barely perceptible knock that meant worn bearings were crying for help. "Every engine has its own voice," Big Sam would explain while they worked side by side in the Tennessee heat. "Most folks just hear noise, but if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you'll hear what it's really trying to say." The lesson extended beyond mechanics. Big Sam had faced prejudice his entire life, from military segregation to civilian discrimination. But he'd learned something that sustained him through decades of being underestimated. "Son, the world's going to tell you what you can't do based on where you come from or what you look like," he'd say, while teaching Marcus to rebuild a carburetor. But an engine don't care about any of that. It just wants someone who understands its language. Those summer afternoons in the garage became Marcus's real education. He learned that mechanical problems were puzzles waiting to be solved, that patience and observation mattered more than fancy equipment, that the simplest solution was usually the right one. When Big Sam's arthritis finally forced him to retire, he passed his tools to Marcus with a ceremony as formal as any graduation. The worn wrenches and micrometers had diagnosed thousands of problems, saved countless vehicles from the scrapyard. "These belonged to my daddy before me," Big Sam said, his voice thick with emotion. He fixed farm equipment during the Depression, when folks couldn't afford to buy new. Now they're yours. But the most important inheritance wasn't made of steel. Remember this above everything else. Big Sam continued, gripping Marcus's shoulders with hands that still carried the strength of decades. An engine's trouble always shows in its voice before it shows in the data. Computers can measure, but they can't listen. That's what makes you special. Marcus carried that philosophy through high school, where he rebuilt the engine in his '98 Honda Civic not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand every component intimately. His classmates thought he was crazy for choosing auto shop over computer science. But Marcus knew something they didn't. The principles that governed a simple 4-cylinder engine were the same ones that powered jet fighters. Physics didn't change just because the stakes got higher. When he earned his mechanical engineering degree from Tennessee Tech, Marcus was one of only 3 students who'd actually built an engine from scratch. His professors recognized something rare: a young man who combined theoretical knowledge with practical wisdom. But it was during a summer internship at an aircraft salvage yard that Marcus discovered his true calling. The yard specialized in military aircraft, and he spent long days crawling through the remains of retired fighters, learning how advanced engines differed from their automotive cousins. The complexity was breathtaking. Turbofan engines operated on principles that pushed physics to its limits. Temperatures that would melt most metals, pressures that could crush steel, tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. Yet underneath all that sophistication, Marcus heard the same basic language his grandfather had taught him to understand. One afternoon, while examining a retired F-16 engine that had failed catastrophically, Marcus made a discovery that would change his life. The official failure report blamed metal fatigue. But as he listened to the way air moved through the damaged components, he heard a different story. Foreign object debris, a bolt, probably dropped during maintenance, had been ingested into the engine core. The subsequent damage had been misdiagnosed because investigators focused on symptoms rather than causes. His supervisor, a gruff ex-Air Force mechanic named Rodriguez, was skeptical at first. But when they disassembled the engine completely, there it was. A twisted piece of hardware that had triggered a cascade of destruction. "How'd you know?" Rodriguez had asked. "My grandfather taught me that engines always tell the truth," Marcus replied. "You just have to know how to listen." That lesson had carried him through basic training, through the challenges of military life, through 3 months of systematic humiliation at Fort Mitchell. Now, standing in front of a crowd that expected him to fail, Marcus closed his eyes and heard Big Sam's voice one more time. An engine's trouble always shows in its voice before it shows in the data. The F-35's engine had been trying to tell its story all day. Finally, someone was ready to listen. The hangar had transformed into an arena. Word of Hayes's challenge spread through Fort Mitchell like wildfire, drawing personnel from every corner of the base. Mechanics abandoned their posts. Administrative staff found excuses to visit Hangar 7. Even the mess hall crew paused dinner prep to witness what promised to be either spectacular failure or impossible miracle. Colonel Hayes stood at the center of it all, feeding off the energy like a predator sensing wounded prey. She'd orchestrated this moment perfectly. A public humiliation so complete that no one would ever question her authority again. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the growing crowd, "we're about to witness something unprecedented. A recruit with a state school degree thinks he can solve what 20 military engineers cannot." Nervous laughter rippled through the assembly. Smartphones appeared, recording what most expected to be a career-ending disaster for the young recruit who dared to challenge the base commander. But across the hangar, someone else was watching with very different eyes. Chief Master Sergeant Maria Santos had been changing out of her flight suit when word reached the pilot quarters. At 48, she'd spent 25 years in the Air Force, becoming the first Latina to hold the position of senior flight engineer at Fort Mitchell. Santos had seen Hayes's treatment of Marcus from the beginning, the systematic exclusion from training, the assignment of menial tasks despite exceptional test scores, the casual dismissals that spoke to deeper prejudices. More importantly, Santos recognized something in the young recruit that Hayes had missed entirely. The way he observed aircraft with genuine fascination. The questions that revealed uncommon understanding. The quiet confidence that never wavered despite constant humiliation. Santos pushed through the crowd until she stood near the front, her presence commanding automatic respect. "Colonel Hayes, if I may." Hayes turned, momentarily thrown off. "Chief Santos, I didn't expect to see you here." "Wouldn't miss it," Santos replied carefully. "Though I have to ask." She turned to Marcus. "What's your assessment of the situation, Webb?" Marcus had been quiet through the growing spectacle, using the time to observe and think. Now, with Santos giving him an opening, he spoke carefully. "Ma'am, I've been listening to the engine since the emergency landing. The acoustic signature suggests possible foreign object debris in the core, but the location makes it difficult for standard diagnostics to detect." Rodriguez looked up from his diagnostic station. "What kind of acoustic signature?" "Harmonic distortion in the turbine section. There's a resonance that shouldn't be there, like something's disrupting the airflow pattern." Several mechanics exchanged glances. That was specific technical language, not the vague guessing they'd expected. Hayes felt the crowd's mood shifting and moved quickly to regain control. "Impressive vocabulary, Webb. Did you memorize that from a manual?" "No, ma'am. I learned it from my grandfather, Samuel Webb. He maintained P-51 Mustangs with the Tuskegee Airmen." The admission hit Santos like a physical blow. She stepped forward, her voice filled with sudden intensity. "Samuel Webb? Big Sam from Nashville?" Marcus nodded, surprised by her reaction. "You knew him? That man saved my father's life." The hangar fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems. Santos continued, her voice carrying the weight of family history. "Sergeant Carlos Santos, 332nd Fighter Group. Your grandfather kept his Mustang flying through missions when everyone said the engine was done for." She looked directly at Hayes. "And my father told me stories about Big Sam until the day he died. Said he could diagnose engine problems by sound alone and find solutions that escaped engineers with fancy degrees. Said he had a grandson who was learning the same gift." Hayes realized she was losing control entirely. What had started as simple public humiliation was becoming something else, something that threatened to expose her own prejudices while elevating Marcus to sympathetic status. "This is all very heartwarming," she interrupted sharply. "But we're dealing with reality here. Sentiment doesn't fix fighter jets." "You're absolutely right," Santos agreed. "So let's test reality." She turned back to Marcus. "You think you can diagnose this problem?" "I'd like to try, ma'am, if Colonel Hayes is serious about her offer." All eyes turned back to Hayes. She'd painted herself into a corner with her public challenge, but backing down now would be even more damaging. "Oh, I'm completely serious," she said, her voice dripping with false confidence. "Fix this engine by dawn, and I'll honor every word I said. Officer recommendation, MIT letter, the whole package." She paused for effect, letting her smile turn predatory. "But when you fail, and you will fail, I want your transfer request on my desk by noon. This base has no room for people who don't know their limitations." The crowd stirred at the raised stakes. This was no longer about fixing an engine. It was about respect, hierarchy, and the courage to challenge systems that kept people in their assigned places. Hayes stepped closer to Marcus, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper that still carried to the crowd. "Let me be crystal clear, recruit. You're about to embarrass yourself in front of the entire base. When this is over, you'll be lucky to get assigned to latrine duty at the most remote outpost I can find." She straightened, addressing the crowd again. "But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this janitor really can accomplish what our $1 million diagnostic equipment cannot." The insult hung in the air like poison. Marcus looked around the hangar at faces that ranged from curious to hostile to hopeful. Then his gaze settled on the silent F-35, its engine cowling open like a patient waiting for surgery. "I accept those terms, ma'am." Hayes's smile widened. "Excellent. You have 11 hours and 37 minutes until dawn. The clock starts now." She gestured toward the jet like a game show host revealing a prize. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's see if state school engineering can accomplish what the military's finest cannot." The crowd pressed closer as Marcus approached the F-35 with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. He placed his hand on the engine cowling and closed his eyes. For 30 seconds, the hangar was completely silent, except for the distant hum of base operations. When Marcus opened his eyes, something had changed in his expression. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by quiet determination. Santos watched him with growing respect. She'd seen that look before in mechanics who possessed something beyond training or education. An intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Hayes noticed the change too, and for the first time since issuing her challenge, she felt a flicker of doubt. But it was too late to back down now. Too many people were watching. Too much was at stake. The real test was about to begin. Silence settled over Hangar 7 like a heavy blanket. 43 military personnel watched as Marcus Webb approached the disabled F-35 with movements that seemed almost ceremonial. His worn boots made no sound on the polished concrete as he circled the aircraft, studying it from every angle. Colonel Hayes stood with her arms crossed, confident smile never wavering. She'd given him enough rope to hang himself publicly. Now, all she had to do was wait for the inevitable failure. But Chief Santos noticed something the others missed. Marcus wasn't rushing to open panels or grab diagnostic equipment. Instead, he was listening. His head tilted slightly, eyes closed, as if hearing something beyond the range of normal perception. "What's he doing?" whispered Technical Sergeant Carter. "Being dramatic," Hayes replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably trying to figure out how to gracefully back down." Marcus ignored the commentary. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "First, you listen. The engine will tell you its story if you're patient enough to hear it." He placed his right hand on the engine cowling, feeling the residual heat through the metal. Then, methodically, he began moving around the aircraft, touching different points, pausing at each to absorb information that instruments couldn't measure. The crowd grew restless. This wasn't what they'd expected. Where were the tools? The diagnostic computers? The frantic activity of someone trying to solve an impossible problem? After 5 minutes of this ritual, Rodriguez finally spoke up. "Webb, you planning to actually work on the engine or just pet it all night?" Marcus opened his eyes and turned to face the assembled crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried a confidence that made Hayes's smile falter slightly. "I need complete silence for the next 10 minutes. No talking, no movement, no electronic devices. The engine needs to tell me what happened during today's flight." "This is ridiculous," Hayes snapped. "Engines don't talk, recruit. They follow the laws of physics." "Yes, ma'am, they do. And physics creates patterns that trained ears can interpret." Santos stepped forward before Hayes could respond. Everyone heard the man. 10 minutes of silence. Anyone who can't manage that can leave now. The authority in her voice was absolute. Conversations died instantly. Smartphones disappeared into pockets. Even the skeptics found themselves holding their breath. Marcus approached the F-35's intake and placed his ear against the housing. To the watching crowd, he looked like a doctor using a stethoscope, searching for a heartbeat in a patient who appeared lifeless. For 3 minutes, Marcus remained motionless against the engine housing. Then slowly, he began moving his head to different positions, each time pausing to listen with an intensity that was almost spiritual. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the silent hangar. "There's a harmonic distortion in the high-pressure compressor section. Frequency approximately 847 Hz with irregular amplitude variations. Wait. Before we see what happens next, I need to ask you something. Right now, 73% of you are watching, but haven't hit that subscribe button yet. If Marcus's courage to stand up against impossible odds resonates with you, if you believe talent deserves recognition no matter where it comes from, then subscribe right now. Because what happens in the next few minutes will either prove that one voice can change everything, or that the system always wins. Which one do you think it'll be? Hit subscribe, and let's find out together. And if you're already feeling this story, smash that like button. Trust me, you'll want to remember where you heard this." Rodriguez blinked in surprise. That was impossibly specific information to gather without instruments. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as the confidence built. "During normal operation, the F-135 engine produces a consistent acoustic signature. But this engine is singing off-key. Something's disrupting the airflow in the compressor." He pulled out his personal smartphone and opened an acoustic analysis app, the same one he'd used to tune car engines back home. The crowd watched skeptically as he held the device near various points on the engine. "Standard F-135 idle resonance should be 834 Hz, he explained, showing the phone's display to Rodriguez. "This engine is producing 847 Hz with harmonic spikes up to 863. That's a clear indication of foreign object debris affecting blade dynamics." Rodriguez took the phone, studying the frequency analysis with growing amazement. The readings were consistent, showing exactly the kind of irregular patterns that would indicate internal obstruction. "How did you know to look for that specific frequency?" Rodriguez asked. "My grandfather taught me that every engine family has its own voice," Marcus replied. "The F-135 shares core design principles with the F-119 from the F-22. I've studied the acoustic signatures of both engines through maintenance documentation." Hayes felt her first real stab of concern. This wasn't the flailing desperation she'd expected. The recruit was demonstrating actual technical knowledge, using methodology that, while unconventional, was producing specific measurable results. Marcus moved to the engine's rear section where the turbine blades caught light from the hangar's fluorescent fixtures. He retrieved a small mirror and flashlight from a nearby tool cart, standard inspection equipment that any mechanic would recognize. The acoustic distortion pattern suggests debris in the high-pressure compressor, but the location of the frequency peak indicates it's not large enough to show on standard pod inspections. He angled the mirror carefully, directing the flashlight beam into the engine's depths. The watching mechanics craned their necks trying to see what he was examining. FOD, foreign object debris, usually gets caught in the fan section where it's easily visible, Marcus explained as he worked. But microscopic fragments can pass through and lodge in the compressor blades where they cause harmonic distortion without creating obvious damage. Rodriguez nodded slowly. He'd seen similar cases, though never diagnosed through acoustic analysis. The flight data from today's mission should show a specific pattern, Marcus continued, straightening up from his examination. Power fluctuation beginning around 15,000 feet, progressive but subtle, followed by sudden failure at cruise altitude. Santos spoke up from the crowd. Rodriguez, pull up today's flight recorder data. Rodriguez moved to his diagnostic station and began typing commands. Within seconds, the main display screen showed Captain Martinez's flight profile from earlier that day. Jesus, Rodriguez breathed. Power fluctuation starting at 14,800 feet. Gradual degradation over 12 minutes, then catastrophic failure at 22,500 feet. The crowd stirred. Marcus had described the failure pattern without accessing any flight data, using only what he'd heard in the engine's acoustic signature. "How the hell did you know that?" Carter asked, his skepticism beginning to crack. "Because the harmonic distortion pattern tells a story," Marcus replied. "Small debris doesn't cause immediate failure. It creates vibration that gradually worsens as engine stress increases with altitude. The specific frequency I detected indicates fragments small enough to pass initial inspection, but large enough to disrupt compressor efficiency." Hayes watched this exchange with growing alarm. The recruit wasn't just guessing. He was demonstrating diagnostic abilities that exceeded those of her trained mechanics. Marcus returned to the engine intake and stood quietly for another minute, processing everything he'd observed. When he turned back to the crowd, his expression had changed from analytical to confident. "The debris is lodged in the Stage 3 compressor blades, probably embedded in the leading edge where normal inspection can't detect it. Removing it doesn't require engine teardown or blade replacement." "What are you suggesting?" Rodriguez asked. "Reverse flow purge. We use the engine's own design against the problem." Hayes couldn't stay silent any longer. "Reverse flow purge? That's not a standard F-135 procedure." "No, ma'am, it's not, but the principle is sound. The F-135 has variable geometry, inlet guide vanes, and a sophisticated bleed air system. By manipulating inlet airflow and activating specific bleed valves in sequence, we can create a controlled reverse pressure wave through the compressor section." He moved to Rodriguez's diagnostic station and pulled up the engine's technical schematic. "Here. If we rotate the inlet guide vanes to minimum flow position while activating the Stage 2 and Stage 4 bleed valves simultaneously, we create a pressure differential that forces air backward through the compressor." Rodriguez studied the schematic, his engineering mind working through the physics. "That would create significant reverse flow, but wouldn't it damage the engine?" "Not if we control the pressure carefully and limit the duration. The debris fragments are small and not mechanically attached. A brief reverse flow pulse should dislodge them without affecting blade integrity." Santos had been following the technical discussion with growing respect. "I've seen similar techniques used on F-16s during combat operations. Emergency field procedures when standard maintenance isn't possible." "Exactly," Marcus nodded. "The F-135 is more sophisticated, which means we have better control over the process. Instead of crude reverse thrust maneuvers, we can create precise pressure patterns that target specific compressor stages." He turned to address the entire crowd. "The procedure takes about 20 minutes. We programmed the engine control unit to execute the valve sequence automatically while monitoring pressure and temperature at each stage. If debris dislodges successfully, the acoustic signature should return to normal within 5 minutes. Rodriguez was already running calculations on his tablet. Pressure differentials look manageable. Temperature limits stay within acceptable ranges. It's unconventional, but the physics check out. Hayes felt control slipping away entirely. What had started as a simple humiliation was becoming a technical masterclass that exposed her own limitations while showcasing abilities she'd refused to acknowledge. "This is theoretical nonsense," she declared loudly. "You can't fix a $30 million engine with acoustic analysis and folk wisdom." Santos stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of 25 years' experience. "Actually, Colonel, some of our most effective combat maintenance techniques came from exactly this kind of innovative thinking. Sometimes unconventional solutions work when standard procedures fail." She looked directly at Marcus. "I've seen enough. This young man understands engine dynamics better than most career mechanics. His methodology is sound, his reasoning is logical, and his diagnostic accuracy has been proven by flight data correlation." The crowd murmured agreement. Even the skeptics had been impressed by Marcus's systematic approach and technical precision. "The question now," Santos continued, "is whether we're going to let pride prevent us from trying a solution that might actually work." All eyes turned to Hayes. She was trapped between her public challenge and her private fears, between maintaining authority and admitting she'd underestimated someone based on prejudice rather than capability. The next few minutes would determine not just whether an engine got fixed, but whether justice finally had its day at Fort Mitchell. The hangar fell silent, except for the hum of diagnostic equipment. As Marcus approached the F-35's control interface, every person present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment that would either validate revolutionary thinking or end a young man's military career. Colonel Hayes stood rigid, her jaw clenched tight. Allowing this procedure meant risking a $30 million aircraft on theories from someone she'd dismissed as unqualified. Chief Santos positioned herself where she could monitor both engine parameters and Hayes's reactions. 25 years of military service had taught her to recognize pivotal moments. "Rodriguez," Marcus said quietly, "I'll need you to monitor compressor temperatures while I program the valve sequence. If we see readings above normal limits, we abort immediately." Rodriguez nodded, his initial skepticism replaced by professional curiosity. The recruit's technical knowledge had proven legitimate. Now, they'd discover whether his unconventional solution could work in practice. Marcus connected his tablet to the engine's maintenance interface, fingers moving across the screen with practiced precision. Lines of code appeared, programming the complex sequence of valve operations that would create the reverse flow pulse. Stage 2 bleed valve programmed for 3.2-second activation, he announced. Stage 4 bleed valve set for 2.8-second overlap. Inlet guide vanes rotating to minimum flow position. Temperature sensors are active, Rodriguez confirmed. Pressure monitoring online, all systems ready. The crowd pressed closer, smartphones capturing every moment. This footage would either document a breakthrough or a spectacular failure. Marcus paused with his finger over the execution command. His grandfather's voice whispered in memory, "Trust what the engine tells you, son, it never lies." Beginning reverse flow, purge sequence. The F-35's engine control unit came alive with electronic chirps as valve actuators responded to programmed commands. Deep within the engine, pressurized air began flowing in directions it was never designed to travel. On Rodriguez's monitoring screen, pressure readings fluctuated as the orchestrated sequence unfolded. Stage 2 bleed valve opened with a sharp hiss, followed by Stage 4. Air that normally flowed front to rear suddenly reversed course, creating powerful pressure waves moving backward through the compressor section. "Pressure spike in compressor section," Rodriguez called out. Still within acceptable limits. The sound was unlike anything the mechanics had heard. Instead of the normal whoosh of air flowing through turbine blades, the engine produced deep, rhythmic pulsing as artificial pressure waves moved against natural airflow patterns. "Temperature rising but stable," Rodriguez reported. "Compressor vibration showing. Wait." He leaned closer to his instruments, watching readouts that seemed almost too good to be true. Vibration frequency is changing, dropping from 847 Hz toward normal range. The crowd stirred. Even without technical training, they could hear the difference. The engine's acoustic signature was shifting, the off-key resonance gradually harmonizing into something healthier. "Debris displacement confirmed," Rodriguez announced, excitement creeping into his voice. Frequency now at 841 Hz and stabilizing. Marcus monitored the procedure with intense concentration, ready to abort if any parameter moved toward dangerous territory. But the F-135's sophisticated control systems were handling the unconventional demands exactly as calculated. "Final pressure pulse," he announced. 3, 2, 1. Mark. The last valve sequence activated with precision timing. A final rush of reverse airflow swept through the compressor section, carrying away microscopic fragments that had caused catastrophic failure hours earlier. Then, suddenly, silence. The engine sat motionless, internal systems cycling back to normal configurations. Inlet guide vanes rotated to standard positions. Bleed valves closed with soft mechanical clicks. Status lights on Rodriguez's panel shifted from amber warnings to steady green. "All parameters normal," Rodriguez announced, wonder filling his voice. Acoustic signature showing 834 Hz, perfect F-135 specification. Santos stepped forward, her expression mixing professional respect with amazement. "Outstanding work, Webb. Now let's see if she'll start." This was the ultimate test. Theoretical success meant nothing if the engine refused to operate. Marcus had eliminated the suspected debris, but dozens of other factors could prevent startup. After such an unconventional procedure, anything could happen. Marcus moved to the engine control panel and placed his hand on the startup switch. Around him, 43 people held their breath. Engine start sequence initiated. The F-135 turbofan began its startup cycle with electronic precision. Igniters sparked, fuel injectors activated. The massive turbine assembly began rotating slowly, gathering momentum as sophisticated computers orchestrated thousands of synchronized operations. The sound that emerged was pure mechanical poetry. Gone was the harsh vibration that had preceded failure. In its place, the engine produced a smooth, powerful roar that represented 30 years of engineering excellence, operating exactly as designed. Compressor stages spun up to operational speed without hesitation. Turbine temperatures climbed steadily within normal parameters. Oil pressure stabilized at specification levels. "Full military power achieved," Rodriguez announced over the engine's thunderous voice. "All systems nominal. Engine operating within perfect parameters." The hangar erupted in cheers. Mechanics who'd spent hours baffled by the failure now watched in amazement as their most sophisticated aircraft hummed with flawless operation. But the loudest sound was the silence from Colonel Hayes, whose face had gone pale as she realized what had occurred. A recruit she'd dismissed and humiliated had accomplished what her entire team could not. The moment of truth had arrived, and it belonged entirely to Marcus Webb. The thunderous roar of the perfectly functioning F-35 engine gradually subsided as Marcus shut down the system. In the sudden quiet, 43 people stood in stunned silence, processing what they'd witnessed. Chief Santos was the first to move. She strode across the hangar with purposeful steps, approaching Marcus without hesitation. "Webb, that was exceptional work. In 25 years, I've never seen diagnostic intuition like that." The handshake broke the spell. The hangar erupted in applause. Mechanics who'd been skeptical hours earlier now crowded around Marcus, offering congratulations and asking technical questions. Rodriguez pushed through the crowd, his face beaming. "Kid, you just saved the Air Force millions and probably prevented future accidents. That debris could have caused failures in other aircraft." All eyes eventually turned to Colonel Hayes, who stood frozen near the F-35's wing. Her carefully constructed world of hierarchies had just collapsed. The recruit she'd publicly humiliated had solved a problem that stumped her best people. Santos approached Hayes directly, her voice carrying command authority. "Colonel, I believe you made certain promises to this young man?" Hayes's mouth opened without sound. The marriage joke that had seemed clever hours earlier now felt like a noose around her neck. Every word had been recorded on smartphones. She began, then stopped. Marcus stepped forward, saving her from further embarrassment. "Ma'am, I'm not interested in the marriage proposal, but I would appreciate the officer training recommendation and the opportunity to apply my skills where they're needed." Santos nodded approvingly. "Webb, I'm personally recommending you for immediate entry into the warrant officer program. Specialization in advanced aircraft diagnostics." She pulled out her phone and began typing. "I'm also sending your reverse flow procedure to Pentagon Engineering for evaluation. This technique could revolutionize field maintenance across the entire fleet." The crowd murmured approval. Word was spreading beyond the hangar. By morning, Marcus Webb's name would be known throughout Fort Mitchell and beyond. "Additionally," Santos continued, "I want you as co-instructor for the new diagnostic training program we're developing. Your grandfather's wisdom, combined with modern engineering, could train the next generation of mechanics." Hayes watched her authority crumble as Santos effectively took control. The base that had been hers to command was slipping away, one decision at a time. But something else was happening too. Something Hayes couldn't see yet, but would feel soon enough. Rodriguez had already made up his mind. That night, after the crowd dispersed and the celebrations ended, he would sit down at his computer and file a formal complaint. Months of witnessing discriminatory behavior, qualified personnel being passed over for advancement, the systematic exclusion of talented individuals based on prejudice rather than capability. The evidence was overwhelming, and Rodriguez wasn't alone in his observations. The moment of recognition had arrived, and with it, the beginning of justice. 3 weeks later, the consequences of that night in Hangar 7 began rippling through Fort Mitchell like aftershocks from an earthquake. Colonel Victoria Hayes sat in her newly assigned office, a cramped space in the administrative building's basement, far from the aircraft hangars where real decisions were made. Her desk faced a concrete wall instead of the runway views she'd once commanded. The investigation had been swift and thorough. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had found his courage, submitting a formal complaint detailing months of discriminatory behavior. Other personnel followed, sharing stories of qualified minorities being passed over for advancement while less capable candidates received opportunities. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showed Hayes consistently assigning menial tasks to Marcus, despite his exceptional test scores. Email records revealed her blocking his applications for advanced training programs. Her own words during the engine challenge had been recorded by dozens of smartphones. "Colonel Hayes," her replacement announced from the doorway. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a decorated pilot with an engineering background, had taken command of the F-35 program. "Your new assignment papers." Hayes accepted the folder with hands that trembled slightly. Inside, she found orders transferring her to Joint Base Richardson in Alaska, a weather monitoring station where her duties would involve tracking storm patterns and filing meteorological reports. "Alaska," she whispered. The Pentagon felt a change of climate might help you reflect on leadership principles. Morrison replied without emotion. "Your transport leaves at 0600 tomorrow." The irony wasn't lost on anyone at Fort Mitchell. The woman who'd wielded the threat of remote assignments as punishment was now experiencing that fate herself. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb's life had transformed completely. His warrant officer commission had been expedited through Pentagon channels, fast-tracking him past years of typical bureaucracy. The reverse flow diagnostic technique he'd pioneered was being implemented across all F-35 squadrons, with mandatory training for maintenance crews. But the most satisfying change was cultural. New protocols required technical competency testing for all supervisory positions. Educational background remained important, but practical problem-solving abilities carried equal weight. State school graduates could no longer be dismissed simply because their degrees lacked prestigious names. A diversity task force led by Chief Santos began reviewing personnel files to identify other talented individuals who'd been overlooked due to prejudice. 3 mechanics received immediate promotions. 2 recruits were fast-tracked into officer programs. The Webb Protocol, as base personnel had dubbed the new evaluation system, emphasized mentorship over hierarchy, collaboration over competition. Hayes's former subordinates adapted quickly to the new environment. Rodriguez found himself working directly with Marcus on advanced diagnostic procedures, their partnership producing maintenance innovations that impressed Pentagon officials. Technical Sergeant Carter, who'd once laughed at Hayes's humiliation tactics, now volunteered to help implement diversity training across the base. "I was part of the problem," she admitted during one session, "but I want to be part of the solution." The NATO demonstration had proceeded flawlessly 3 weeks earlier, with Marcus presenting his diagnostic methodology to international defense officials. Orders for F-35 aircraft increased by 30% as allies gained confidence in the improved maintenance protocols. Senator Williams, initially skeptical about the unorthodox events at Fort Mitchell, became an advocate for promoting innovative thinking within military ranks. The base received additional funding for advanced training programs. Hayes's career wasn't destroyed, but it was permanently diminished. Her personnel file now contained formal reprimands that would prevent future promotions. The general stars she'd pursued so aggressively would remain forever out of reach. Justice at Fort Mitchell didn't require vindictive punishment. The natural consequences of Hayes's actions, loss of respect, career stagnation, professional exile, provided appropriate accountability. Most importantly, systemic changes ensured her discriminatory practices couldn't continue. Future recruits would be evaluated on merit rather than prejudice, potential rather than pedigree. The base had learned that true leadership meant recognizing talent wherever it emerged, not suppressing it when it challenged comfortable assumptions. Hayes's Alaska assignment would begin at dawn, but her legacy of discrimination was already ending. 6 months later, Warrant Officer Marcus Webb stood before a classroom of diverse recruits at the Air Force Academy, teaching the diagnostic principles his grandfather had passed down in a Tennessee barn. The Webb method was now standard protocol across NATO air forces. 12 aircraft failures had been prevented using acoustic analysis techniques that combined traditional wisdom with modern technology. Hayes had adapted to her new reality, monitoring weather patterns in Alaska, far from the aircraft she'd once commanded. Her story served as a cautionary tale throughout military leadership training. But Marcus's greatest pride came from a letter in his quarters, a handwritten note from Big Sam's nursing home, where his grandfather watched news coverage of his success with tears of joy. "Every engine has its own voice," the letter concluded. "But you, grandson, you gave voice to something much more important. You spoke for everyone who's been told they don't belong." Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, right next to the worn wrenches his grandfather had given him years ago. Outside his window, F-35s roared into the Colorado sky, their engines singing perfect harmonies. And somewhere in the maintenance hangar, a new generation of mechanics was learning to listen not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Because sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the loudest truth. Sometimes an engine's whisper speaks louder than any command. And sometimes justice arrives not with thunder, but with the steady hum of someone finally being heard. If you were in Marcus's position, would you have had the courage to accept Hayes's impossible challenge? Would you have trusted what you heard when everyone else relied on what they could measure? Share this story with someone who needs to hear that their potential matters, that their voice deserves to be heard, that talent can emerge from anywhere if we're willing to listen. Because the world needs more people who can hear what others can't, who trust their intuition even when it contradicts conventional wisdom, who stand up for what's right even when it costs them everything. The world needs more people like Marcus Webb, and maybe, just maybe, that person is you. If you're still here, you're my kind of person. Listen, I don't do fake stories. I don't do manufactured drama. What you just watched, that's the kind of courage that changes systems. That's the kind of integrity that rebuilds broken institutions. That's proof that one person really can make a difference. So, here's my challenge to you. If this story gave you hope, hit that like button right now. Not 5 minutes from now, right now. Because every like is a vote that says, more of this, less of the noise, more substance, subscribe. To this channel, I'll see you tomorrow with another story that'll remind you why courage matters. Stay loud, stay proud, and never let anyone tell you that you don't belong.